They are ready for you, your majesty.
How do I keep my people from eating their own dead?
Power is easiest to love when it tells us what we already plan to hear. It is safest to hold when it corrects us. Fear grows where counsel is hoarded. Obsession is the ritual that makes monsters of good intentions. But in a kingdom that remembers the shape of listening, even heads may rest, and silence itself becomes an ally. They call it the Winter of 13 Bells, year 1472, in the borderland of the Upper Marches, where the forests crush the horizon and the sea howls like an unquiet wolf. Snow fell in sheets, and the bells rang for plague, for famine, for war. In that winter, a noble woman stitched her fate to the mouths of the dead. Lady Isolde of Mornwald, daughter of a dowager whose name rotted from the scrolls, married at 15 to Lord Argrave, the Red Warden, conqueror of the salt mines, governor of hunger. Her castle stood on a black cliff above the fjord. They built it on a burial hill. The old people said the hill had teeth. The chronicler, Brother Corbin, leaves a note in his shredded ledger. 2 barrels of salt, 12 casks of grain, 1 box of preserved trophies. He draws a small skull beside the word trophies and scratches it out. He writes beneath, in script purpler than bruises, advice. The box was found in the ruins decades later. The heads were gone. Only stains. Only a faint scent of saffron and lye and something sweeter. The smell of honeyed decay. But in the winter of 13 bells, the box was full, and the mouths were ready. Isolde learned from a traveling Moorish apothecary named Bashir. He sold tinctures and delusions, and a recipe whispered in breathy Latin. Not necromancy, he said, not against the canon, merely preservation. So the dead could be honored, so justice could be witnessed, so memory would not spoil. He taught her to keep the jaw hinged with wax and fox sinew, to oil the tongue with clove and wine, to paint the face with ash and alum. He taught her to tamp the nostrils with salt, to anoint the ears with kine resin. He did not teach her what price would come from asking questions. The court laughed at first, a lady with a cabinet of skulls, a northern vanity. But starvation swallows ridicule. When the ice hit the barley and the fish were found belly up beneath a crust of black ice, when a boy hanged for stealing bone broth and a girl coughed her lungs into the snow, they stopped laughing. Isolde's husband stopped laughing. He bled his peasants for rations and asked her, soft as a blade in straw, what the dead would suggest. She lit 13 candles. She set the heads in a circle like idols carved from rain. 3 of them were criminals hanged on the alder tree. 1 was a monk. 1 was a rival lord she claimed as a prize from a border skirmish. 1 was her mother's sister, drowned in a fever of grief. The last was Whisper Small, a child from a family no one could help. She turned them all into witnesses. She turned them into a counsel. Her first question, how do I keep my people from eating their own dead? The monk head shifted in its bowl of rosewater, lips cracking, a sound like paper torn. He said, put grain under the mountain. He said, break the tithes. He said, close the roads to the king's riders. The rival lord, grin still on his face, said nothing. The child said, don't forget us when the thaw comes. She obeyed the monk. The barn was emptied and food vanished into tunnels dug by miners as children. Old women sang into the holes to bless the grain. The abbess sealed the mouths sworn to the king. The roads closed with wagons overturned and an avalanche engineered by desperate hands. In the snowlight, it looked like a miracle. In spring, it would be treason. Isolde's circle widened. The heads became advisors with portfolios. The monk handled policy, the thief spoke for the street, the maiden for mercy, the rival lord for war, though he hardly breathed. He preferred to mock her. The woman who drowned spoke for the accursed, and the child reminded her to count the missing. Every head a department of the mind, every mouth a door. Captain Odrin Kale watched from the threshold. He served the Red Warden and loved him not. He loved the land beneath the ice and the people who warmed his sword hand with trust. He saw that Isolde's advice saved lives, and he believed until he did not. The whispers reached King Sigismund's court in Evenholm, a lady in the north telling severed heads to set policy. No one knew where the story began. Maybe a drunk miller who saw too much light in her windows, maybe a monk who wrote a letter that he then burned. But the tale reached a chancellor whose ear belonged to a rival realm. The king, who feared portents more than armies, demanded proof. He framed it as concern for the soul of his warden's household. He dispatched a confessor. He dispatched a spy. The spy was a woman with hair the color of elm leaves, named Allen, who had once worn gray in the abbey and learned to read hearts better than books. She came to Mornwald as a seamstress and watched the servants carry bowls lined in silk. She heard wet mouths chitter when the door was closed. She counted candles. She counted the hungry. Isolde received her as a guest. She saw the steel beneath her smile and chose truth with the boldness of hunger. She drew Allen into the chamber and said, "Watch." When the mouths stirred, Allen swayed as though the floor had moved. Isolde asked how to appease the king. The monk said, "Put grain under the mountain." He said, "Break the tithes." He said, "Close the roads to the king's riders." The rival lord, grin still on his face, said nothing. The child said, "Don't forget us when the thaw comes." She obeyed the monk. The barn was emptied and food vanished into tunnels dug by miners as children. Old women sang into the holes to bless the grain. The abbess sealed the mouth sworn to the king. The roads closed with wagons overturned and an avalanche engineered by desperate hands. In the snowlight, it looked like a miracle. In spring, it would be treason.
King Sigismund read it by his fire. He did not sleep that night. He whispered to an empty room, "The North thinks, and I do not know their thoughts." The second winter devoured the first. Ice formed on the inside of doors. The fjord froze into a road. Wolves walked down to the docks and examined human faces like maps. The bells chimed for an entire village that went to bed and never woke. Isolde doubled her séances. Her circle of heads became a parliament. Farmers came to the castle gates with gifts of garlic and bones. They begged for predictions, for omens, for what the dead could see beyond the blind white weather. She met them in the cold courtyard and spoke in a voice that could calm an avalanche. She lied only about herself. She told the truth for everything else. Captain Odrin Kale, standing tall in fur and iron, carried her messages into the hamlets. He saw people survive who would have frozen without her counsels. He saw babies named for the drowned woman and the thief. He saw the Red Warden smile as if he had found a way to tax miracles. On the eve of the Feast of Candles, a soldier brought back a head from the southern battlefield, wrapped like a gift. The soldier's hands shook. He said, "From the king's friend, the Duke of Var." It came with parchment. He handed Isolde a letter sealed with the royal sigil. The king offered an amnesty, he wrote. He offered clemency for her unusual devotions. He requested a demonstration in the capital. She would bring a head and advise the throne, and the North would remain under her watch. She could be a wonder and not a witch. She could be protected. Argrave laughed at the letter. He drank 3 cups and poured the 4th on the flagstones. Isolde smiled in the way that makes men step back from cliffs. She accepted. Olin went pale. The spy had grown roots in the rooms she was meant to break. She had eaten their bread. She had taken the child's lullaby into her chest. She begged Isolde not to go. Isolde said, "If we do not choose the stage, they will drag us onto it in chains." On the road to Ivanholm, the sky broke open with thunder that had no storm behind it. The carts jolted on ruts carved by centuries of war. Isolde kept the oak box at her feet. The heads murmured through linen. She shushed them like squabbling cousins. They entered the capital with banners rolled and torches smothered. The king's palace rose like a sledged whale, old and full of old smells. Mutton, beeswax, secrets. Crowds filled the square. Some threw flowers, some threw stones. King Sigismund wore velvet trimmed with wolf teeth. His confession priest stood behind him like a shadow pinned to a different wall. Chancellors lined the benches and bled ink into dry logs. Isolde did not tremble. She asked for a table and clean water. She opened the box. She placed the heads in a crescent like a moon scything through clouds. The child head blinked. A sound rippled through the room as if grain had poured from a high sack. The king stepped forward and asked his first question in a voice trained by theater. "How do I win the South without losing the North?" The heads breathed. The monk answered with strategy, the thief with sabotage, the drowned woman with sacrifice. The rival lord said, "You must break your friend the Duke of Var, because fear spreads faster than favors." The child said, "Do not lead us through blood to bread." The king's lip twitched. He asked his second question, quieter. "Does heaven see me?" The monk said, "Heaven doesn't vote." Silence took the room by the hair and dragged it. Then from the corners a whisper rose, "Witch, witch, witch." The confessor held up a black book and began a prayer to drown them all. Isolde raised her hand. She said, "Your Majesty, the dead speak to anyone who listens. Power is merely the right to refuse." She had intended to charm him. She discovered she had challenged him. It was then that Captain Odrin Kale, who had stayed in the shadows, saw the knife. The confessor's deacon, a boy of 19 with tears still salted on his cheeks, slid across the floor with a blade meant for the lady's throat. Odrin moved like a storm and took the boy by the wrist. The blade rang on stone. The court screamed like geese. The king flinched and waved for calm. He declared the demonstration concluded. He declared it miraculous and unsettling, and to be reviewed by a council of the godly. He ordered the heads sealed and kept in the royal reliquary until judgment. The box left Isolde's hands. She bowed and bled dignity. She did not show her hunger, which roared like a second sea beneath her ribs. They sent Isolde home with empty hands and assurances swaddled in silk. In the night, a messenger brought news that the reliquary had burned. A candle, they said, an accident, the whole wing, the heads, the relics, the bones of saints, ash. The king declared a day of sorrow. He absolved himself in public, in tears. In the north, bells were counted for the dead. 13 bells should have rung, 14 did. The number was wrong, and the old people said that meant a soul had been miscounted. The miscounted soul comes home. Odrin found Isolde in the chapel. He prayed to a god who speaks best through absence. He told him he did not believe the fire was an accident. He told him the king had silenced them because he feared a council he could not bribe, could not imprison, could not kill. Isolde took a deep breath and called for Bashir, the apothecary, who had returned to Mornwald with new vials, new spices, and new secrets. She told him to prepare a head that still had a name in the capital. He shook his head to guard her from the path she would walk. She did not turn. She did not blink. Downriver, they found a drowned man who had served the king's table. Lady Isolde swore him to counsel. She prepared him with hands steady as law. She anointed him. She set him in the circle with the others she had saved in jars the king did not know she kept.
Yes, twist one. The box the king seized had been a decoy. The reliquary held the heads of thieves and saints. Her true advisors had slept in the mountain, wrapped in wolf fur and the last linen from her wedding day. The fire had killed relics and decoys. Her circle remained. They took a breath. They spoke. The drowned man from the palace, with water still inside him, said a different name burned the reliquary. Not the king, not the confessor. He whispered it like a splinter pushed under the tongue. Ahlin. Ahlin, the spy, the seamstress, the almost sister. She had carried a candle under her cloak. She had used her thread to stitch a smokescreen. She had done it, he said, to protect Isolde. If there were no heads, there could be no trial. If there were no trial, there would be no pyre. She had thought the heads in the box were the only ones. Isolde's hand drifted. She touched the rim of the bowl as if it would bite her. She exhaled a frost. She did not speak for a long time. When she did, she said, "I asked for advice. I received loyalty. I failed to count it." She told Odrun to bring Ahlin. He found her on the road, riding hard for the borders. He brought her home in silence. She walked into the circle and knelt. "I thought I saved you," Ahlin said. "I thought I could burn the stage before they lit the actress. I did not know you had others. I did not know anything can be multiplied, especially guilt." Isolde forgave her, but forgiveness arrived like a coin at the bottom of a well, late, cold, far from useful. The north murmured, the bells fell quiet, snow stopped, and winter broke cleanly, like a neck. Spring brings thaw, thaw brings movement, roads open, men with paper move before men with swords. A new letter came from the king. He invited himself to Mornwald. He announced a progress through his lands. He would bring blessings and soldiers and his own cook. Isolde understood one thing clearly. She had taught a nation to listen to voices that could not be seated in parliament or paid in gold. The king would crush the habit. He would make a ritual of ending rituals. He would arrive with a sermon and leave with a silence. Bashir warned her to flee. Odrun told her to fight. Ahlin asked to stand at her left, needle in hand, eyes on the door. Lady Isolde decided on a third path. She would host him. She would be gracious. She would set a table. She would lay a trap only the dead could spring. On the day of the king's arrival, Mornwald gleamed like a blade licked clean. Flags snapped in the salt wind. The harbor rang like a bell, with fishermen beating their nets dry. The people lined the causeway with rye tied in sheaths and old northern welcome. The king arrived with velvet and musk and a retinue large enough to drink a lake. He patted children on the head. He blessed a calf. He told a joke about monks and geese that made the abbess laugh through her teeth. They entered the great hall. Its walls were hung with tapestries that made war look like embroidery. The table creaked under roasted game and sugared fruits brought from alien climates by men who had never seen a snowflake. The king tasted everything. He made a show of sharing bites with his hosts. Isolde smiled and watched his hands. When the dusk slouched in, she asked to retire to a smaller chamber for a northern custom, honored by the king in a letter he would later deny. A simple observance, she said, a requiem for those who did not see spring. The king, curious and primed by flattery, agreed. They entered the stone room with the table and the box. Candles wept, bowls waited.
The heads she had loved looked up and opened their mouths. They did not counsel her this time. They addressed the king. The monk spoke first. I absolved 50 men who broke their vows under your tax, and I would absolve 50 more. The thief, I stole bread, you stole winters. The drowned woman, I was a river, and you damned me with laws. I overflowed and drowned my own house. The rival lord smiled. I tried to unseat you with armies. She almost unseated you with whispers. The child, count us correctly, Majesty. The king went pale and made a sign he had not seen since he was a boy. He lifted his hand to command his guards. None moved. Odrin had dismissed them with wine and a kindly lie. The king desired no witnesses. And then twist two. The severed head that spoke last was not one Isolde had owned. It was new. It was the head of Lord Argrave, the Red Warden, her husband, and it was still warm. He had died in the courtyard an hour before, at a gallop, thrown from his war-horse. A stirrup strap had snapped, the harness had been cut. Whether by god or ghost or man, no one knew. The head looked at Isolde the way men who love power look at women who use it. He said, "Did you whisper this into being?" She said nothing. The king swayed. He understood that the north had slipped beyond his fingers. He felt the truth rush up. Fear makes counsel. Counsel makes power. Argrave's head turned toward the king. His lips peeled back like bark in a fire. He said, "You will not leave this hall unchanged." He told the king where the mountain grain lay. He told him which abbess kept secrets. He told him the names of 6 lords who had cheered for Isolde's parliament of heads and 3 who had prayed for her burning. He told him with a soldier's clarity that the north would stand behind the lady if it had to stand in graves to do it. The king put his hand on the table. He steadied himself. He had come to crush a ritual. He had found a nation. He did not give the order to kill her. He asked for wine. He drank it like love, desperately, forgetting the taste immediately afterward. He asked to make a treaty. He asked to make it tonight.
Isolde agreed. She dictated terms that would feed her people and keep her council intact. A royal charter for local assemblies, not of heads, but of elders. Amnesty for those who had met in secret. Grain shipments from the south. Repairs to the fjord road. Taxes counted in winters instead of coins. The king signed. The ink looked like a wound, clotting. Alin watched his hand. Bashir watched the candles. Odrin watched the door. Treaties unravel. They love it. Words like to wriggle loose. The ink barely dried before the king's confessor wrote a counter-law. He decreed, "The dead do not speak. Anyone who hears them commits a crime against breath." Isolde expected it. She had already moved on to a new stage, a quieter one. She dismantled her circle. She wrapped each head in linen and laid them in the mountain grain as if planting. She whispered, "It is enough." She sent Bashir south with a bundle of recipes and a purse of silver, and told him to vanish among markets where spices hid more secrets than monks ever penned. She sent Alin east with 2 small children, whose names had been miscounted by bells, to smuggle their lives past wolfish borders. She sent Odrin to the villages, with the charter rolled in waxed leather, to read at doors and in barns and on river stones. And then, twist 3, she sealed a letter to the king confessing nothing and everything, that she had listened, that she had obeyed, that she had disobeyed. She wrote, "My counsel never belonged to the heads. It belonged to the grief of those you cannot hear over the ceremonies of your court." She wrote, "I do not threaten you, I describe you." The king wrote back, a single line, "Then describe me less." Summer curtsied in on tired feet. Children laughed in the harbor. The abbess died in her sleep. The southern grain arrived 2 months late and spoiled in its barrels. The wolves bred twice. 4 lords fell without battles, one to a fever, one to a stare, one to a kiss with poison in it, one to a prayer that never ended. The treaty held. then frayed, then held. Isolde withdrew to her room. Alin's letter reached her from the eastern border with a pressed violet and a stain where a tear had made the ink bloom. She had delivered the children. She was heading for a monastery that did not ask questions. She wrote, "I burned a hall for you once. I will spend the rest of my life carrying water." Bashir's note arrived from a city with walls baked in the sun. He had opened a shop. He had invented a perfumed oil that turned a room into a forest. He sent a vial. She uncorked it. The smell nearly made her fall from her chair, a scent like winter with the ache removed. Audrin returned at last, with news. In every village where he had read the charter aloud, a new council of elders had formed. They did not use heads, they used memory. They swore to count the living correctly. He said the people had begun to ring their bells not only for the dead, but for each harvest stored, each child born, each winter survived. He took Isolde's hand and asked her to marry him once the mourning veil untied. She looked at the sea, then at the mountain, then at his mouth. She said, "I am already married to a problem." He smiled as a man smiles at a storm he admires. He said, "Then let me be your umbrella." She laughed as if she had never done it before. Autumn came with a knife's edge, crisp and clean. Lady Isolde set the oak box on the table one final time. She had one head left. She had kept it for last because it frightened her, and because she did not know if it would speak at all. It was the head of the child who asked to be counted. She had never named them. She had feared ownership. She lit no candles. She let the dusk do the work. She unwrapped the linen slowly, as if unveiling a statue. The child's mouth was small. The lips were dark, almost blue. The eyes had collapsed. She thought of berries in frost. She asked no questions. She said, "I am tired." The child's mouth moved as if forming the shape of a hearth fire. The words came like moths, brittle and beautiful, breaking as they touched air. "You are finished listening to us. Begin listening to yourself. You are finished asking for permission. Begin writing it." She closed the mouth. She kissed the linen. She laid the head under the mountain with the others. She walked back to the great hall and ordered the table removed. She called the stonemason to close the listening room's door with a wall. In the capital, King Sigismund's hair thinned. He grew lighter as though someone had burned a candle inside him that ate him from the ribs out. He walked in his garden, where the snowdrops dared to rise early. He spoke to no one when he passed the old reliquary's charred stones. He began making decisions that surprised even himself, and made his confessor pale. He freed a prison for debtors. He forbade the sale of children. He let the monks teach letters to fishermen. He did it with no fanfare, and with a face like a man who hears a bell no one else hears. That winter, only 11 bells rang. The 12th remained silent through a miracle or a lie. The 13th never sounded again. The North learned to count accurately. The South learned to listen to the pause between rings. Isolde grew old like iron left in snow, darkening, pocking, steadfast. She attended councils of elders and never spoke first. She wrote a slim book under a false name. She titled it, "The Weight of Advice." It circulated in secret. Men in velvet and farmers with hands like nets memorized lines and pretended they had always known them. One line remained. "We do not consult the dead to hear their words. We consult them to hear our own without noise." Her end came quiet, in a chair by a window with glass stolen from a monastery storeroom. Audrin held her hand. Bashir sent oils. Alin sent a final violet. The wind brought salt. The bells waited.
The country she left behind forgot how to forget her. Children told the story of the Lady of Mornwald who whispered to heads in bowls of rosewater and changed a king's hand mid-stroke.
In one village, they saved a single slice of bread all winter with her name carved into the crust. In another, they built a door where there was no wall and whispered counsel through it, as if the dead preferred privacy. They say the heads are still in the mountain, honeyed and asleep. They say their mouths stay closed unless the number of bells rings wrong. Then you can hear them, a low choir through stone, telling the living to adjust the count. They say King Sigismund died in the night with a smile, because a voice he had not heard since he was a child told him that heaven does not vote, but it sometimes nods. They say Odron never married because he had wed a country. They say Aline became a prioress, and that she burned no more halls, and that when new novices arrived with needles in their sleeves, she taught them thread can mend more than it can bind. They say Bashir's forest oil became a ritual in kitchens to remember winter's sharp kindness. And in the old castle on the cliff, where the salt eats stone and the wind gnaws lintels, the listening room is sealed. No candles, no table, no bowls. A wall, and behind it, air that remembers questions. What was the true cost of advice measured in breaths? Where did the line shudder between reverence and theft, when a mouth that loved you answered a question it had not been asked? Did Isolde command the future by checking its pulse, or did she learn to honor it by folding the dead back into sleep? Here is what the story instructs without demanding. Power is not a throne or a blade or a council of skulls. Power is the discipline to hear what frightens you and act without becoming the fear. Fear births tyrants. Listening births revolutions that leave ghosts unemployed. So the bells ring for harvests now, for births, for winters ending like songs that find their final note. 11, sometimes 12, never 13. And if one year the count is wrong, and a 13th echoes through the fjord like a thread pulled from the border of a woven world, if that happens, lean close to your closed doors. Tilt your head to the wall. Inhale the faint scent of clove and winter. Consider your question. Answer it yourself before the dead help you. They remember. They always will. But they prefer our mouths. They prefer the living to learn.